The Roman legionary, even hearing the name brings to mind iron discipline, unstoppable strength, and relentless order. Imagine an army marching under burning desert suns and through frozen forests, leaving behind roads, bridges, forts, and entire cities, while crushing anyone who dared resist. These soldiers conquered half of the known world and built an empire that lasted for 1,000 years. But what gave them the power to do this? What allowed a single man to march 30 kilometers a day carrying 40 kilo of gear, then build a fortified camp overnight, strong enough to withstand an enemy tribe's attack? The answer wasn't only strict training or discipline, it also came from what simmered in their camp cauldrons. And here's where things may surprise you. Their diet wasn't the protein-packed meals of gladiators or the luxury banquets of Rome's rich families. Instead, it was a carefully organized and efficient food system, as important to Roman power as the short sword gladius or the throwing spear pilum. So, what did a legionary actually eat? What drink did they rely on that would taste like sour punishment to us today? What secret ingredient did they stir into nearly every dish? And why was a simple loaf of bread valued more than a soldier's pay? The answers reveal a hidden key to Rome's military success. At the very foundation of the greatest army in history was not meat, not vegetables, but grain. The legionary was, in truth, powered by carbohydrates. Grain was their high energy fuel. Each soldier received a daily ration called a nona, and grain made up the bulk of it. This system of supply, known as a nona militaris, was one of Rome's most impressive achievements in logistics. It became a vital pillar of the state itself. And why grain? Because it was simple, practical, and efficient. The perfect solution for feeding an army that carried the empire on its shoulders. Grain was the perfect food for Rome's soldiers for several reasons. First, it was extremely high in calories and nutrition. It gave soldiers a steady, lasting energy supply that kept them moving through long marches, digging trenches, or building fortified camps after hours of exhausting labor. Second, grain was cheap and easy to produce. Wheat and barley grew in huge amounts across the empire. Entire regions, Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, were turned into bread baskets, their main role being to keep Rome and its legions supplied. Instead of being collected in money, grain was often taken as a tax, which made it easier for the state to gather massive amounts of food for the army. Third, and perhaps most important for logistics, grain stored extremely well. In dry form, it could sit in special granaries for months or even years without going bad. It could also be transported with relative ease, packed into sacks and carried by wagons or loaded onto ships. No other food offered all three of these advantages at once. The main grain used was wheat, particularly the hard variety called triticum durum. This was the grain that made the best bread and porridge. But when wheat was harder to grow, such as in northern Britain, or when soldiers were being punished, barley was issued instead. To Romans, barley was considered animal feed, and forcing legionaries to eat it was a mark of shame. After an act of cowardice or rebellion, a legion might be punished by decimation, where 1 in 10 men was executed, and the rest were sent outside the camp walls to live on barley rations, a humiliation they would never forget. Every soldier received about 850 grars of grain each day, roughly equal to 3 Roman pounds. At first glance, this seems like a massive amount. But during active campaigns, a legionary could burn up to 6,000 calories a day. This ration of grain alone provided around 3,000 calories. It's also important to note that soldiers were not handed ready-made bread. What they received were raw grains, and it was up to them to grind, prepare, and cook their own meals from these daily rations. The reason soldiers received raw grain rather than flour or bread was purely practical. Grain lasted much longer, spoiled less easily, and was harder to steal. Because of this, every legionary had to prepare his own food from scratch. Among his standard gear was a small hand mill called the molla manuaria, 2 heavy round stones, weighing several kilograms, which he carried everywhere as part of his required baggage. After a long day of marching, a soldier would sit down and begin the tiring routine of grinding his daily ration. This was just as much a part of his life as sharpening his sword or repairing his worn-out sandals. Grain wasn't only a source of food. It was the very backbone of Rome's military strength. Once the grain was ground, the soldier had to cook it. Although Rome is strongly associated with bread, baking fresh loaves while on the move was nearly impossible, especially during fast-paced campaigns. Instead, legionaries used quicker, more practical methods to turn grain into meals, adjusting their cooking depending on the situation. The oldest and simplest dish was called pulse. This thick porridge made from coarse grains like spelt or wheat is considered the ancestor of Italian polenta and was seen as the national food of early Rome. Soldiers would boil the ground grain in water with a bit of salt until it became a hearty, filling mass. From there, they could improve the flavor with whatever was available: grated hard cheese, caseus, garlic, onions, wild herbs, or small pieces of salted meat. Pulse was warm, easy to digest, energy-rich, and perfect after a long, exhausting day. It filled the stomach, restored strength, and kept a soldier going. However, the main marching food of the legions was not porridge, but hard bread, sometimes called soldier's bread or military biscuits. This was the ancestor of army hardtack and naval ships' bread used for centuries afterward. To make it, grain was ground into flour, mixed with water and salt, and baked into hard, dry flatbreads or rings. The goal was not taste, but durability, food that could last a long time and withstand the hardships of military campaigns. These military cakes were baked twice, which is where the Latin word biscuit comes from, meaning twice baked. This second baking removed every trace of moisture, leaving a product so hard it was almost like stone. Because of this, it could be stored for months without spoiling. Eating them dry was nearly impossible. They were so tough you could risk breaking your teeth. Soldiers usually had to soak them in water, wine, posca, or broth, which softened them back into a kind of porridge. Even so, carrying just a few of these hard cakes in a marching bag meant having an invaluable supply of energy during long marches, especially when there was no chance to build a fire. When the army was stationed in a permanent camp or fortress, soldiers could finally enjoy real bread. Large camps had their own bakeries with heavy stone ovens. The bread produced there was much rougher than modern loaves, dense, coarse, often made with bran, and usually baked without yeast, using sourdough instead. This bread was known as panis militaris, soldier's bread. Sometimes smaller groups of soldiers, called contubernia, built their own simple clay ovens to bake fresh bread. For a legionary, getting a warm loaf straight from the oven instead of hard biscuits was a rare luxury and a clear sign that the unit was in stable, well-organized service. This shows how versatile a soldier's grain ration really was. From it, they could prepare hot porridge at the end of the day, durable hard bread for long marches, and fresh loaves while stationed at camp. This flexibility in food was another reason the Roman army remained so effective in the field. And food was not the only necessity. When it came to drinks, most of us think of water and wine in the ancient world. But for the Roman legionary, there was a third option, a drink as essential as his sword or shield. This was called posca, and it wasn't just a way to quench thirst. It was the ancient world's version of a sports drink, a clever invention perfectly suited to the needs of soldiers, fulfilling several important functions at once. So, what exactly was posca? At its core, it was a simple mix of water and sour wine, or wine vinegar. Fine wine was reserved for officers and the wealthy, but the cheaper sour wine, known as acetum, which was too unpleasant to drink on its own, was transformed into posca. For the common soldier, this drink became a daily essential. Posca was usually diluted with water in a set proportion. At times, honey or herbs like coriander and mint were added to make it more pleasant. To us today, the idea of drinking water mixed with vinegar may sound unpleasant, even harsh. But for the Roman soldier, posca was essential to survival for several reasons. First, safety. On campaign, clean water was a constant problem. Rivers, streams, and lakes were often contaminated, leading to dysentery and other intestinal diseases that could cripple a legion faster than enemy attacks. The acetic acid in vinegar acted as a mild antiseptic. Mixing it with water killed off some harmful bacteria, making the drink far safer than plain water. This simple method helped protect soldiers from deadly outbreaks. Second, hydration. Posca was more refreshing than plain water. The sour flavor encouraged salivation, and in hot weather it felt cooling and satisfying. Modern studies confirm that drinks containing small amounts of acid and electrolytes actually help the body absorb fluids more efficiently. In other words, posca functioned as an early form of an isotonic drink, restoring hydration and salt balance after long hours of marching under the blazing sun. Third, calories and nutrition. Vinegar made from wine provided minerals such as potassium and small amounts of vitamin C. For soldiers under constant physical strain, this was valuable, and it even served as a protection against scurvy. Because of all these benefits, posca became an official part of a legionary's daily ration, issued just like grain. The system was simple. Concentrated vinegar was shipped in barrels, then diluted with water when needed. Each soldier carried a flask, called a legula, filled with this drink. The importance of posca even appears in the Gospel accounts. It was this very drink that a Roman soldier offered to the crucified Christ on a sponge. Far from being mockery, it was likely a gesture of compassion, the offer of an ordinary soldier's drink to ease unbearable thirst. Of course, when clean water was available and safe, legionaries drank it as well, but in most campaigns, posca remained the standard and trusted drink of Rome's soldiers. Wine, when given to ordinary soldiers, was usually part of a reward or a special festive ration. Beer, on the other hand, was widely consumed by barbarian tribes such as the Celts and Germans, but Romans considered it a crude and unworthy drink. Still, in the northern provinces where grapes could not be grown, legionaries had little choice but to adapt. Archaeological finds at Fort Vindolanda confirm that soldiers stationed there drank the local beer, known as cervisia. Grain may have been the foundation of the Roman diet, but commanders knew that protein was just as important for keeping soldiers strong and motivated. Meat, although far less common than grain, was therefore a required part of a legionary's rations. The most common meat was pork, and there were practical reasons for this. Pigs matured quickly, ate almost anything, and provided fatty, calorie-rich meat. More importantly, pork could be preserved easily. Fresh meat in a marching camp was nearly impossible to manage because it spoiled so quickly. To solve this, pork was delivered in salted or smoked form. Bacon was the most common product, though corned beef was also known. Salt and smoke were the two main preservation methods in antiquity, allowing meat to be stored for weeks or even months and carried over long distances. A small piece of salted pork tossed into a soldier's pot of pulse porridge could transform a plain meal into a hearty and flavorful dinner. Besides pork, beef, goat, and mutton were also eaten, particularly in areas where livestock was abundant. Roman armies often moved with entire herds of cattle, which acted as walking food supplies. When necessary, the animals were slaughtered to provide fresh meat for the troops. Yet the official ration was only part of the story. Hunting played an equally important role. A Roman legionary was not only a fighter but also a skilled hunter. During pauses in the march or while stationed in one place for longer periods, soldiers actively hunted local game. Deer, wild boars, hares, and birds all found their way into the cooking pot. Hunting was more than a way to diversify meals. It also sharpened combat skills, encouraged teamwork, and kept weapons practice alive. For the legionary, hunting was both survival and training rolled into one. Hunting was considered an important privilege for Roman soldiers, and they took advantage of it whenever possible. They didn't waste any opportunity. Even small animals like squirrels could end up on the menu. Fishing in rivers and lakes was also a common pastime that provided both food and relaxation. More unusual foods were not ignored either. Archaeological evidence from Roman forts shows that soldiers ate oysters, mussels, and other shellfish when stationed near the coast. Edible snails were another source of nutrition, and in some cases, they were even bred specifically for food. Frogs, too, could be eaten when available. For men serving thousands of miles away from home, any extra source of protein was considered valuable. The Roman army was practical and understood that a healthy diet required more than just grain and meat. Commanders knew the importance of vegetables and herbs in keeping soldiers fit and preventing illness. Although these were not as standardized as grain rations, they played a major role in everyday meals. The official supply system mainly included vegetables that stored well and could be transported over long distances. Onions and garlic were at the top of the list. They were not only appreciated for their strong flavor, which improved otherwise plain food, but also for their medicinal properties. Romans believed garlic gave strength and protected against sickness. Every soldier carried several heads of garlic with him. Other vegetables included cabbage, turnips, carrots, and different legumes such as lentils, peas, and beans. Dried legumes were especially useful since they lasted for long periods, provided plenty of protein and fiber, and could be added to porridge or stews. Most fresh fruits and vegetables, however, were not supplied through official channels. Instead, they were sourced locally. When legions stayed in one place for a long time, soldiers often built small gardens around their camps. There they grew leafy greens, lettuce, cucumbers, and other perishable vegetables during their spare time. This not only improved their diet, but also gave them a useful activity outside of battle. For Roman soldiers, collecting food from nature was an essential survival skill. Most of them came from farming backgrounds, so they knew a great deal about wild plants. They gathered edible herbs, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, roots, wild berries, and mushrooms, resources that could be life-saving, especially when marching through unfamiliar lands. Fruit was another important part of their diet. In the southern provinces, figs, grapes, and dates were common. These fruits were often dried, which made them easy to store and provided soldiers with a quick boost of energy. In the northern provinces, wild apples, pears, and plums were collected instead. This combination of official rations and locally sourced food made the Roman soldiers' diet as flexible and balanced as possible under the circumstances. Certain staples like onions, garlic, and cabbage were valued not only as food, but also as preventive medicine, protecting soldiers from scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies. But even the most nutritious meal can feel unbearable if it lacks flavor. The Romans knew this well, which is why every soldier's ration included 3 essential flavor boosters. These were the foundation of Roman cooking, and they turned simple porridge into a satisfying meal. The first was salt. In a world without refrigeration, salt was more than just seasoning, it was a strategic necessity. It preserved food, kept it safe to eat, and made it taste far better. Its importance was so great that the very word soldier is linked to it. The Latin word solidus referred to a coin used for pay, part of which was set aside for buying salt. From this we get the term salarium, or salt money, which eventually became the root of the word salary. For Roman soldiers, salt was literally part of their wages. The second key ingredient was olive oil. In the Mediterranean world, oil was everything. It was food, medicine, fuel, and even skincare. Soldiers received olive oil regularly in their rations. They used it to add flavor and calories to their porridge and stews, to fry food, and to protect their skin from harsh sun and wind. A supply of good quality olive oil was more than a luxury. It was proof that the army was well provisioned. The third and most surprising ingredient in a Roman soldier's diet was garum, also known as liquamen. This was a fermented fish sauce, and for the Romans it was as common as ketchup or soy sauce is for us today. Garum was made by layering small fish together with their guts and blood, then covering them with salt and leaving the mixture to ferment under the hot sun for several months. The result was a thick liquid, rich in protein and amino acids, salty, spicy, and with a very strong smell. To us, the recipe may sound unpleasant, but to the Romans, garum was the true taste of home. It carried what we now call the 5th flavor, umami. Just a few drops could transform a plain stew or porridge into a flavorful, filling meal. Garum wasn't produced in small amounts either. It was manufactured on an industrial scale across the empire, sealed in containers, and distributed to the legions. To Roman soldiers, it was more than just seasoning. It was nutritious too, packed with minerals and protein. For a legionary stationed in the cold, damp frontiers of Britain, adding a spoonful of garum to hot porridge wasn't only about taste. It was a small comfort from the sunny Mediterranean that reminded him of home. Together, salt, olive oil, and garum formed the trinity that made Roman rations not just edible, but enjoyable in their own way. But food alone wasn't enough. What truly set the Roman army apart was its ability to organize supplies. The success of long campaigns depended on one of the most advanced systems of military logistics in the ancient world. In fact, logistics was as much a weapon of Rome as its soldiers. At the center of this system were the famous Roman roads. These weren't only built to move troops quickly, they were also designed to move supplies. Caravans of wagons carrying grain, oil, and other necessities could travel smoothly and without interruption across the empire. Along the borders and in key provinces, the Romans built a chain of military warehouses called horaea. These granaries stored huge reserves of grain, wine, oil, and other essentials, often enough to last for months. Whenever a legion went on campaign, it could restock at these bases before pressing forward. Supply was organized in several ways, ensuring that the legions never starved even when far from home. Centralized supplies from Italy and other provinces usually traveled by sea and rivers, and then continued along the Roman roads. Special officials and military officers called intendants were in charge of managing these shipments. Another important source of food was local procurement. The Roman army often bought provisions directly from the local population, which actually boosted the economy in conquered provinces. But there was also a harsher approach: requisitioning. In wartime, the army had the legal right to seize food from locals without payment. This practice solved urgent supply shortages quickly, but it also bred resentment among the people. Each legion moved with a massive convoy of hundreds of mules and wagons. These carried not only tents and siege equipment, but also large amounts of provisions. However, Roman commanders knew that too much baggage slowed an army down. To avoid this, every legionary was required to carry a portion of his own supplies. On Trajan's column, we can see Roman soldiers marching with saws, pickaxes, and heavy travel sacks. Inside those sacks were rations of grain or hard bread, enough to last several days, along with a hand millstone, a kettle, and a flask. This system made each soldier partly self-sufficient and allowed the legions to move swiftly, even when far from their main supply train. This balance of centralized planning, advanced infrastructure, and individual responsibility formed the backbone of Roman logistics, one of the hidden reasons why their armies seemed almost unstoppable. But how did all this food actually turn into hot meals for thousands of men? The answer lies in the army's cooking system, which was just as organized as its battle formations. The legion was divided into cohorts into centuria, and centuria into small groups called contubernium. The contubernium was the smallest unit, made up of 8 soldiers who shared a single tent. More importantly, the contubernium was also the basic kitchen team. The men of one contubernium received their rations together, ground their grain together, and prepared meals together. Each unit had its own simple cooking kit, which they used daily. Each contubernium was equipped with a bronze cauldron for boiling meals and sometimes a spit for roasting meat when conditions allowed. A single mule with a cart carried the tent, millstones, and other shared tools for the group. After setting up camp in the evening, the men would gather around to prepare food in their communal cauldron. Cooking was a shared responsibility. One soldier collected firewood, another built the fire, while a third handled the cooking. Eating together around the fire strengthened bonds of trust, turning 8 ordinary men into a close-knit fighting family. Alongside the shared equipment, every soldier carried his own personal dining kit, known as a vasa. The main piece was the patera, a flat bronze or iron pan with a long handle. It was a versatile tool that could be used to warm porridge, fry meat, and serve as a plate. Soldiers also had a simple clay or wooden mug and a spoon. The Romans never used forks. Most meals were eaten with spoons or by hand. These items were built to last, made from bronze, iron, or clay. Archaeologists have found many of them across the old Roman Empire, often with a soldier's name scratched into the surface. Each piece is a silent witness to countless fireside meals from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the banks of the Euphrates. The simplicity and practicality of this system allowed the Roman army to feed thousands of men efficiently while keeping discipline and morale high. But life as a legionary was not only about routine marches and plain porridge. The army also recognized the importance of celebrations and special rewards to keep spirits up. On religious festivals or after victories, the rations could change dramatically. During major events, such as Saturnalia or the emperor's birthday, soldiers were given upgraded and festive meals, a welcome break from the monotony of daily food. On feast days, rations were often upgraded. Instead of the usual posca, the sour wine soldiers drank every day, men might receive good quality wine. Fresh meat, often from animals sacrificed during the ceremonies, and better quality bread were also served. Commanders knew that eating well and celebrating together strengthened bonds within the ranks, and reminded soldiers that they were part of a powerful and supportive imperial system. A major victory, or the end of a campaign, was marked with even greater celebrations. A commander could host a grand banquet for his legions, not just as a way to mark success, but also to thank his men for their courage and endurance. Reliefs such as those on Trajan's column show scenes of soldiers receiving food and enjoying these communal celebrations. Food was also tied directly to the reward system. Along with money payments or medals, brave soldiers, or sometimes entire units, might be given an extra ration of wine, cheese, or meat. This simple but tangible reward carried strong meaning. In some situations, men were even treated to delicacies. Coastal garrisons, for example, regularly received oysters, a prized luxury in Roman culture. Evidence from the Roman frontier confirms this. Letters uncovered at Fort Vindolanda in Britain list purchases of pepper, honey, and other costly spices, showing that even on the empire's edges, soldiers and officers sought to enrich their meals whenever possible. Of course, much depended on the character of the commander. One legion might serve under a generous leader who shared the best food with his troops, while another could suffer under a harsh officer who hoarded supplies for himself. Still, the very possibility of a reward, knowing that after brutal fighting, you might enjoy roasted meat and a mug of fine wine, was a powerful motivator. It gave men strength to face the endless hardships of service. The Roman supply system was impressive, but it was not without flaws. During long sieges, exhausting marches through wilderness, or simply because of poor planning by commanders, Rome's mighty supply system could fail. And when that happened, legionaries faced a fight not against an enemy, but against hunger itself. Their normal rations gave way to desperate measures. The first step was always ration cuts. Once those were in place, soldiers turned to whatever they could gather from the land. Roots were dug from the earth, wild herbs, berries, mushrooms, and acorns were collected. Rivers and streams became vital sources of food where fish, frogs, and crayfish were caught. When this still wasn't enough, the army began slaughtering animals that were never meant for the cooking pot. Transport mules and oxen were often the first to go. Their meat was stringy, but it kept men alive. If things grew worse, horses were killed and eaten, even prized cavalry war horses. That was a clear sign of total desperation. One of the most famous examples came during the siege of Alesia. Julius Caesar's troops, who had surrounded the Gauls, were themselves encircled and trapped. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, Caesar describes how his soldiers survived by harvesting grain from nearby fields, risking death every time they crossed the lines. When starvation pushed men beyond all limits, the most extreme acts were recorded. Historian Plutarch wrote about Mark Antony's Parthian campaign, where starving soldiers resorted to eating the bodies of fallen comrades. Cannibalism was unthinkable in Roman culture, but in moments of complete collapse it became a last horrific resort. More commonly, soldiers turned to their gear. Leather sandals, belts, shield covers, even horse harnesses were boiled to make a thin broth. Some even stripped bark from trees, chewing it just to trick their stomachs into feeling full for a little longer. These dark moments remind us that behind Rome's great victories and shining triumphs lay a brutal truth. A legionary was expected to endure anything, even the misery of starvation. The Roman soldier was trained not just to fight and win, but also to survive under the harshest and most unforgiving conditions. His ability to adapt, from eating standard rations to living off roots or even boiled leather, was in itself a weapon of endurance. The food system of the Roman army was not a matter of taste or luxury, but a masterpiece of planning and practicality. It was designed to keep an enormous army strong, mobile, and ready for battle no matter the circumstances. The diet was built around calories, portability, and balance, as much as the conditions of war would allow. At its core was grain. From this, soldiers prepared thick porridge or baked it into rock-hard bread that could last for days. Instead of plain water, they often drank posca, a sour but safe and refreshing mix of water and vinegar. Their meals were reinforced with salted pork, wild game, vegetables, and of course the famous garum fish sauce, which gave even the simplest food a strong flavor. But behind this diet was more than just tradition. It was the backbone of a powerful logistics system. Supplies, organization, and discipline worked together to ensure that Rome's armies could operate where other forces would have collapsed, from hunger. The legionaries' food was not about refinement, it was about efficiency. Every portion was calculated, every ingredient had its role. In the end, the soldier's cauldron tells us something important. The Roman Empire was not built only with the sword, but also with bread. If you enjoyed this journey into the field kitchen of the Roman legions and want to discover more about the everyday lives of people in the greatest empires of the past, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Many more fascinating and little-known stories from history are waiting for you.